Helena walked up the courthouse steps, her heart pounding with excitement. Today was the first day of her new role as judge, a dream she had worked so hard to achieve. She had spent countless nights studying, battling self-doubt, and overcoming every obstacle thrown her way. Today, she was ready to walk into that courtroom and prove that she belonged. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more gripping stories just like this one. All right, buckle up. This one's going to hit you right in the feels. Her simple but elegant black suit was pressed to perfection. She kept her chin high, her stride purposeful. The courthouse loomed before her, a symbol of justice that she was proud to serve. Near the entrance stood two bailiffs, Officer Mitch and Officer Dan, hands crossed over their belts. Their gazes shifted to Helena, eyes narrowing as she approached. Mitch, a stocky man with a permanent scowl, took a step forward, blocking her path. "Public entrance is on the other side," he said coldly. Helena blinked, her smile faltering. She thought she'd misheard. "I'm supposed to be here. I have a case," she explained, her voice calm but firm. Dan, taller and younger but with a smug grin, chuckled. "Oh, really? What are you, a reporter or the new janitor?" Helena's throat tightened, but she took a steadying breath. "No," she said, meeting their eyes. "I'm Judge Helena Matthews." The silence was deafening. Mitch let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Judge? You?" he scoffed, crossing his arms. "Nice try." Dan shook his head and muttered under his breath. "She must be joking." "If you don't leave now, we'll have to call security," Mitch warned. Passers-by slowed, murmurs rippling through the crowd as they watched the confrontation unfold. Helena stood frozen, disbelief and anger swirling in her chest. The stares from the growing crowd felt like stones thrown in her direction. What should she do? Walk away quietly, or show them exactly who she was? Her fingers tightened around her briefcase. She wasn't just a woman standing outside a courthouse. She was a judge. But would anyone believe her if she stood alone against their prejudice? Time felt like it was standing still. The bailiffs smirked, thinking they'd won. The choice was hers. Mitch's fingers hovered over his radio, ready to call for backup as though Helena was some kind of intruder. Suddenly, the heavy courthouse doors swung open with a loud creak. Everyone's heads turned. A tall, older man with silver-streaked hair and an air of authority strode out. His long, black robe billowed behind him. It was Chief Judge Wallace, a man whose presence commanded instant respect. His sharp eyes scanned the scene and then landed on Helena. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise and then to warm recognition. "Judge Matthews," Wallace's voice boomed, echoing across the courtyard. The crowd fell completely silent. Murmurs died in mid-sentence. Mitch and Dan turned pale. Dan's jaw dropped slightly, and Mitch's confident smirk twisted into confusion. "Wait, what?" Mitch mumbled under his breath, as though trying to convince himself he'd misheard. Judge Wallace strode toward Helena and reached out to shake her hand firmly. His grip was strong but reassuring. "We've been expecting you," he said, his tone apologetic. "I'm so sorry for this delay." Helena returned his handshake, though her fingers still trembled with emotion. Judge Wallace's expression darkened as he shifted his gaze to the bailiffs. "What's going on here?" The color drained from Mitch's face. Dan's smugness vanished, replaced by panic. The growing crowd began to murmur again, piecing together what had just happened. Mitch stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. We thought she was someone else." Wallace's eyes burned with disappointment as he narrowed his gaze. "You thought wrong." Dan opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. Helena took a slow, deliberate step forward. The murmurs around her quieted again. She fixed her gaze on Mitch and Dan, her voice calm but cutting like a blade. "You didn't think at all." The bailiffs looked like they wanted to sink into the ground. Their arrogance had turned to pure shame, and the weight of their mistake pressed down on them like a crushing wave. Behind them, some bystanders raised their phones, capturing the moment. A story of judgment, injustice, and karma. Helena straightened her back. The gavel of fate had already fallen. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Helena sat in a quiet office, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The events of the morning replayed in her mind, the stares, the humiliation, the cruel laughter of the bailiffs. Linda, her loyal assistant, stepped into the room, holding a file of reports. She leaned in close and whispered, "This is your chance to set an example." Helena's heart ached. She could feel the weight of Linda's words. This was more than just about her. It was about every person who had been disrespected because of how they looked, because of where they came from. But then, her father's familiar voice echoed in her memory. True justice isn't about revenge. It's about changing hearts. Helena closed her eyes for a moment. Her father had been her hero, a man who always chose compassion over anger, even when it was hard. Could she do the same? Meanwhile, in another room, Mitch and Dan sat side by side, their uniforms wrinkled, their confidence shattered. Dan looked pale and shaken, guilt weighing on his shoulders. He whispered, "We were wrong." His voice cracked with regret. Mitch scowled, crossing his arms. "They're just making a big deal out of nothing," he muttered, though even he didn't sound as sure anymore. Dan glanced at him with tired eyes. "You don't get it, do you? We denied a judge entry because we didn't even give her a chance." Mitch looked away, his pride still clinging on, but his silence said more than his words. Moments later, the door opened. The room fell silent as Helena stepped inside. Her presence was powerful, not because of anger, but because of calm resolve. Dan stood up nervously. Mitch remained seated, avoiding her gaze. Helena's eyes swept over both men. "Before I make my decision," she began, her voice steady but laced with meaning, "I need to know if you understand what really happened today." The room felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Whatever happened next would change everything. Helena sat across from Mitch and Dan, her posture calm but commanding. The small room felt suffocating with the tension that hung in the air. She let the silence stretch before speaking, her eyes steady and piercing. "Do you know what it feels like to be treated like you're invisible, like you don't belong?" she asked quietly. Dan's eyes filled with tears. He nodded slowly, guilt etched on his face. Mitch, however, kept his arms crossed, staring at the floor. Yet there was no defiance left, only a fragile layer of pride trying to hold itself together. Helena took a deep breath. "When I was a little girl," she began, "I was told I'd never make it in a place like this. People laughed when I said I wanted to be a judge. But I worked hard. I rose above it all. And here I am." She leaned forward, her voice steady. "You see, your job isn't just to guard doors. It's to guard justice." Dan's shoulders trembled. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't stop to think. I just assumed, and I was wrong." Helena's gaze shifted to Mitch. For a moment he said nothing, but then his rigid stance softened. He let out a shaky breath and muttered, "I'm sorry." His words weren't loud, but they were real. Helena stood, adjusting her robe. "I don't need revenge," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "But I demand respect, not just for me, but for everyone who walks through those doors." Mitch and Dan nodded, humbled. In the following weeks, the courthouse issued new mandatory training on respect, equity, and bias for all staff. Helena's story became a symbol of change, not through punishment, but transformation. The courtroom was packed as Helena presided over her first case. The room hushed the moment she raised her gavel. Her strength was palpable, and the respect in the air was undeniable. At the entrance, Mitch and Dan stood at attention, their eyes lowered in quiet reverence. As Helena walked past them, they opened the doors, not out of duty, but out of newfound respect. Justice had been served, not by fear, but by the power of change.